The farm stood lonely at the edge of the valley, its fields dry and its fences sagging under the weight of neglect. The barn, once a sturdy shelter for animals, now creaked in the wind like an old man's bones, its wood weathered and splintered. Inside, where the hay should have been soft and sweet, it was damp and rotting, filling the air with a sour smell of mildew. This was where Lila and Ben slept not by choice, but by the command of the woman who ruled their lives with a hand as hard as iron. Martha had not always been cruel. At least, that was what their father, Thomas, had believed when he brought her home 2 winters past. She had smiled then, her voice honeyed with promises to care for his motherless children. But the moment Thomas left for his long trips driving cattle to the farm markets or hiring himself out as a farmhand, Martha's kindness vanished like smoke in the wind. The children quickly learned that her smiles were as false as the gold rings she wore, polished bright to fool the world. Lila, the elder at 12, bore the worst of it. She had her mother's sharp eyes and stubborn will, and Martha hated her for it. Every chore was never done well enough. Every word was backtalk. Every glance defiance. Ben, younger and smaller, tried to make himself invisible, but even his silence earned him blows. When Thomas was home, Martha pretended to be gentle, fussing over the children with false concern. But as soon as his wagon disappeared down the road, the broomstick came out, the ropes were fetched, and the barn became their prison. That evening, after a supper of thin broth and stale bread, Martha had found a crack in her favorite dish, a blue-painted thing she treasured more than the children themselves. She did not ask who had done it. She never did. Her fingers closed around Lila's wrist like a bear trap, her voice a hiss in the girl's ear. "You ungrateful wretch." The words were familiar, as was the sting of the switch that followed. Ben, trembling in the corner, tried to plead for his sister, but a backhanded blow sent him crashing into the wall. Then came the rope's rough hemp biting into their wrists as Martha dragged them to the barn, her breath hot with fury. The night was cold, the kind that seeped into bones and made teeth chatter. Lila pressed close to Ben, whispering stories to keep him from crying. She told him of knights and dragons, of faraway kingdoms where children were loved and no one ever slept in barns. But the tales faltered when Martha returned, her shadow looming in the lantern light. The switch whistled through the air, and the children's cries rose into the darkness, swallowed by the vast, uncaring night. Beyond the farm, the road stretched empty under the moon. No one ever came this way. No one ever heard. Until tonight. The wind carried the sound farther than the children could have hoped, sharp, broken cries slicing through the still night like a blade through cloth. It traveled past the sagging fence posts, over the brittle stalks of the neglected fields, and onto the dusty road where a lone rider slowed his horse, ears straining against the dark. Mr. Dawson was a man who had spent his life listening to the shift of cattle in the brush, to the warning snap of a twig where no foot should fall. He knew the difference between the screech of a fox and the whimper of a child, and what reached him now was no animal sound. He turned his horse toward the farm at a gallop, the lantern swinging from his saddle casting wild shadows across the ground. The barn loomed ahead, its door slightly ajar, a sliver of dim light leaking out like a secret too heavy to keep. The screams had faded into ragged sobs by the time he dismounted, but the silence that followed was worse. A man didn't ride this far into the valley without knowing the rumors, whispers about Thomas's sharp-tongued wife, about the way his children had grown too thin, too quiet. Mr. Dawson's jaw tightened as he pushed the barn door open. The scene inside was worse than he'd imagined. The children, a girl and a boy, were bound to the support beam, their wrists raw from struggling against the ropes. The girl's face was streaked with dirt and tears, but her eyes burned with defiance even as she flinched from the light. The boy, younger and smaller, had gone limp, his head lolling forward like a broken doll's. Between them stood Martha, her arms still raised, the switch in her hand glinting in the lantern's glow. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Martha's lips curled into something that wasn't a smile. "This ain't your concern," she spat, but Mr. Dawson was already crossing the barn in 3 long strides. He wrenched the switch from her grip, snapping it in half with a crack that seemed to echo off the walls. Martha's face twisted in fury, her hand flying up as if to strike him instead, but he caught her wrist, his voice low and dangerous. "Try it," he said, "and see what happens." For the first time, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. Without another word, he turned to the children, his hands gentle as he worked at the knots. The girl Lila, he'd later learn, stiffened at his touch, her breath coming fast, as if waiting for a trick. The boy, Ben, didn't react at all until Mr. Dawson scooped him into his arms, and then it was only a faint whimper, like a creature too used to pain to hope for comfort. Martha's voice cut through the quiet, shrill with venom. "You take them. You answer to their pa." Mr. Dawson didn't bother looking back. "I'll answer to God first," he said, and kicked the barn door wide open. The night air was clean and cold, sharp with the promise of coming rain. Lila stumbled after him, her legs unsteady, her fingers clutching at his coat like she feared the earth might swallow her whole. Behind them, Martha's curses chased them like thrown stones, but they faded with every step toward the road. Mr. Dawson's horse, well-trained and patient, stood waiting. He mounted first, then reached down for Ben, settling the boy against his chest before extending a hand to Lila. She hesitated, her eyes darting from the farm to the dark horizon beyond. "He won't let us go," she whispered, not meaning her father. Mr. Dawson's voice was quiet but firm. "Ain't her world anymore." And with that, he spurred the horse forward, leaving the barn and the woman inside it to the shadows. The road unspooled beneath the horse's hooves like a thread pulled taut by unseen hands, carrying them farther from the broken barn and the woman who had turned it into a house of horrors. Lila clung to Mr. Dawson's back, her fingers twisted in the rough fabric of his coat, her body rigid with the fear that this was merely another trick, that at any moment Martha would come thundering after them, her voice sharp as a whip crack, her hands eager to drag them back into the dark. Ben, limp and silent in the rancher's arms, had not spoken since they left, his shallow breaths warm against the man's shoulder. Moonlight silvered the fields as they rode, transforming the world into something strange and new, a place where shadows no longer felt like enemies. The rhythm of the horse's gait should have been soothing, but Lila could not relax. Every rustle in the brush made her flinch. Every distant call of a night bird sounded like Martha's mocking laughter. She watched the back of Mr. Dawson's head, the set of his shoulders, searching for some sign of what awaited them. Men were not to be trusted, this much she knew. Even her own father had failed to see the truth until it was too late. Then the ranch appeared, rising from the land like a promise. It was nothing grand, a sturdy house of timber and stone, a well-tended barn, fences standing straight and strong, but to Lila, it seemed a fortress. Lamplight glowed in the windows, pushing back the night, and as they drew closer, the door swung open. A woman stood there, her silhouette framed by the warmth behind her. She did not wait for them to dismount before rushing forward, her skirts whispering against the dirt, her hands already reaching. "Dear God," she breathed as the lantern light fell across Ben's too-thin face, the bruises on Lila's arms. Mrs. Dawson did not ask questions. She did not demand explanations. She simply gathered the children close, her touch as gentle as morning light, and ushered them inside. The house smelled of bread and herbs, of wood smoke and lice, soap clean, solid things. A fire crackled in the hearth, its heat a living thing that wrapped around Lila's frozen bones. Ben, still mute, stared at the flames as if they were a language he had forgotten. Mrs. Dawson knelt before them, her hands hovering, careful not to frighten them further. "You're safe now," she said, and though the words were simple, they carried the weight of an oath. Then came the rituals of mercy. A basin of warm water, a cloth to wipe away the grime and blood, a table laid with thick slices of buttered bread, a pot of stew rich with meat and potatoes. Lila watched Ben's trembling fingers close around the spoon, his movements slow and cautious, as if expecting the food to be snatched away. When he finally lifted it to his mouth, his eyes widened. Real hunger met at last with real nourishment. Mrs. Dawson's gaze met her husband's over their heads, a silent conversation passing between them. Upstairs, a room had been prepared, not a loft strewn with filthy straw, but a proper bedroom, with a quilted bed and a trundle tucked beneath. There were even curtains, thin and sun-faded, but curtains all the same. Lila stood in the doorway, her throat tight. "This ain't for us," she whispered, because kindness, in her experience, always came with a price. Mrs. Dawson's hand settled on her shoulder, light as a fallen leaf. "It is," she said, "for as long as you need it." That night, for the first time in years, the children slept without ropes, without fear. The wind outside carried no threats, only the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of leaves. And though Lila's dreams were still haunted by shadows, when she woke to the sound of a rooster crowing, for one fleeting moment, she forgot where she was. Then she remembered. And for the first time, remembering did not hurt. Morning arrived not with the sharp crack of a switch or the cruel yank of a rope, but with a slow, golden spill of sunlight through the bedroom window. Lila awoke with a start, her body tensed for punishment, her breath caught in her throat like a trapped bird. But there was no Martha looming over her, only the quiet creak of the house settling, the murmur of voices downstairs. For a moment, she lay perfectly still, listening to the unfamiliar rhythm of safety. Ben still slept beside her, his face slack, the bruises on his arms fading to sickly yellows and greens. She touched his shoulder, just to be sure he was real, then slipped from the bed, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Downstairs, Mr. Dawson stood by the hearth, his boots dusty from an early ride. His face was grim as he spoke to his wife in low tones, but when he noticed Lila hovering in the doorway, his expression softened. "Sheriff Hayes is coming," he said, as if she had asked. "He'll want to hear what happened from you and Ben." The words sent a bolt of fear through her. The law had never been a friend to children like them. People looked the other way when a parent's hand was heavy, called it discipline, called it their right. But Mr. Dawson's gaze was steady. "He's a good man. He'll listen." The sheriff arrived mid-morning, a tall figure astride a dappled mare. His badge gleamed in the sunlight, his hat shadowing eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. Lila watched from the window as he dismounted, his hand resting briefly on the pistol at his hip, not in threat, but in habit. Ben, now awake but silent as ever, pressed close to her side, his fingers twisting in her sleeve. Mrs. Dawson's hand was warm on Lila's back as she guided them to the kitchen table where Sheriff Hayes waited, his hat in his hands. He did not rush them. He did not scoff or dismiss their words. Instead, he listened as Lila spoke in halting sentences, her voice barely above a whisper. She told him of the barn, of the ropes, of the way Martha's anger could turn a simple mistake into a beating. Ben, when coaxed, nodded along, his small hands clenched into fists in his lap. The sheriff's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Your pa know about this?" Lila shook her head. "He's always gone," she murmured. "And when he's home, she pretends." Sheriff Hayes exchanged a look with Mr. Dawson, something unspoken passing between them. Then he stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'll ride out to your place today," he said. "See what your stepmother has to say for herself." The day stretched long and uneasy after he left. Lila tried to distract herself by helping Mrs. Dawson knead bread dough, but her hands trembled so badly the woman finally took over, her touch gentle. Ben sat on the porch steps, staring at the horizon as if expecting Martha to appear at any moment, her skirts flying behind her like the wings of some terrible bird. It was nearly dusk when Sheriff Hayes returned, his horse's flanks heaving with exhaustion. Behind him, slumped in the saddle like a man defeated, rode Thomas. Lila's breath caught at the sight of her father, his face haggard, his clothes rumpled from hard travel. He dismounted slowly, as if every movement pained him, and when his eyes found his children, they filled with a grief too deep for words. "I didn't know," he choked out, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. The sheriff's voice was firm. "You will now." Martha, he explained, had been taken to the jailhouse in town to await trial. Thomas would not meet his children's eyes as the sheriff spoke of neglect, of cruelty, of laws broken. When the words finally ran out, the silence that followed was heavier than any before it. Thomas reached for Lila, his hand shaking, but she stepped back, her body rigid with a betrayal too fresh to name. It was Mr. Dawson who broke the silence. "The children will stay with us," he said, not unkindly, but with a finality that brooked no argument. "For now." Thomas opened his mouth as if to protest, then closed it again. He looked at Ben's hollow cheeks, at the way Lila held herself like a creature ready to bolt, and something in him crumpled. "I just wanted," he began, but there was no excuse good enough, no apology wide enough to bridge the chasm he had allowed to open. Sheriff Hayes clapped a hand on his shoulder, not unkindly. "Go home, Thomas. Get your affairs in order. We'll talk tomorrow." As the men rode away, Lila stood on the porch, watching until their figures blurred into the gathering dark. Ben's small hand slipped into hers, his grip tight. Behind them, the door opened, spilling lamplight across the steps. Mrs. Dawson did not call them inside. She simply waited, a quiet presence at their backs, until they were ready to turn away from the night. The days at the Dawson ranch stretched long and golden, each one marked by rhythms so foreign they felt like fragments of a dream. Dawn no longer meant clenched fists and hissed threats, but the low murmur of Mr. Dawson stoking the fire, the rich smell of coffee bubbling in the pot. Lila woke each morning braced for cruelty, her body coiled tight as a spring, only to find the world stubbornly gentle. It unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Ben, though still quieter than he'd been before Martha, had begun to shadow Mr. Dawson like a second shadow. There was safety in the man's steady presence, in the way he showed rather than told how to mend a fence without splinters, how to hold a newborn lamb without crushing its fragile bones. The boy's hands, once clumsy with fear, grew deft under patient guidance. But it was the animals who truly drew him out. The barn here was nothing like the one they'd known. It smelled of sweet hay and warm milk, and the horses nuzzled Ben's pockets for apple cores, their breath soft against his palms. One evening, as he scratched behind the ears of an old hound dog, Mr. Dawson heard something he hadn't in weeks. Ben's laugh, bright and startled, as if surprised by its own existence. Lila watched her brother's transformation with wary eyes. She wanted to believe in this new world, but trust was a thread too easily snapped. Nights were the hardest. However soft the bed, however thick the quilts, sleep brought no refuge. Martha's face leered from the darkness, her hands reaching, her voice sharp as broken glass. Lila would wake gasping, her nightgown damp with sweat, her throat raw from screams she couldn't remember making. Mrs. Dawson always came. Not with scolding, not with sighs of annoyance, but with a lantern and a calm voice. She would sit on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap, and hum snatches of old songs, the same ones, Lila realized with a jolt, that her own mother had sung. One night, shaking too badly to speak, Lila found herself clutching the woman's sleeve, her fingers trembling. Mrs. Dawson stilled, then carefully gathered her close, as one might hold a wounded bird. No one had held Lila like that in years. The dam inside her cracked. By daylight, pride sealed her lips again, but the ranch had ways of softening even the hardest edges. There was work here, real work, not the endless, thankless chores Martha had devised, but tasks that left calluses and satisfaction in equal measure. Lila learned to churn butter, her arms aching as the cream thickened to gold. She collected eggs with hands that no longer flinched at sudden movement. And once, when Mrs. Dawson trusted her to stir the bubbling blackberry jam, she tasted a scrap of praise so sweet it burned. Still, the past clung like burrs. When Mr. Dawson raised his voice to call the dogs, Lila dropped the milk pail, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. When a stranger rode up to the fence, her first instinct was to hide Ben in the root cellar. Progress was not a straight path, but a series of stumbles and catches, of hands held out and slowly, so slowly taken. Then came the afternoon Thomas returned. He stood at the gate, hat in hand, his face lined with a grief that had little to do with Martha's arrest. Lila froze, her arms full of fresh laundry. Ben, sensing her tension, pressed against her side. Thomas took a step forward, then stopped, as if the mere sight of their wariness was a wall he couldn't breach. "I came to say," his voice broke. I'm sorry, don't cover it, but it's all I got. Lila said nothing. The wind tugged at the sheets in her arms, snapping them like sails. It was Ben who moved first. Slowly, hesitantly, he walked to his father and held out a small, dirt-streaked hand. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a bridge, however fragile. Thomas knelt in the dust, his shoulders shaking. From the porch, Mrs. Dawson watched, her eyes bright. Mr. Dawson, beside her, squeezed her hand. Healing, like trust, was a thing built moment by moment. And for the first time, the future stretched before them, not as a thing to fear, but to shape. The air between them hung heavy with words unsaid, thick as the summer heat that shimmered over the pasture. Thomas remained kneeling in the dirt, his calloused hands hovering just above Ben's shoulders, close enough to feel the boy's warmth, but not quite daring to touch. Lila watched from a distance, the laundry forgotten in her arms, her pulse a wild thing caged behind her ribs. She had imagined this moment 100 times, her father's return, his remorse, the desperate hope that things might somehow stitch themselves back together. Now that it was here, she found herself frozen between the child who still ached for him and the girl who had learned the hard way that love was no shield against harm. Thomas's voice, when it came, was roughened by dust and regret. "I thought she'd care for you proper," he said, the words cracking open like overripe fruit. "I thought, but there was no thought that could undo what had been done." His gaze flickered to Lila, then away, as if the sight of her stillness pained him more than Martha's betrayal ever had. Ben, ever the peacemaker, reached out and tucked his small hand into his father's larger one. The gesture was tentative, a question more than an absolution, but Thomas's breath hitched, as though he'd been given the world. "You're bigger," he murmured, tracing the sharp line of Ben's wrist where bone pressed too close to skin. But not enough. Behind them, the Dawson house stood solid and welcoming, its windows glowing amber in the fading light. The contrast between this home and the one they'd left behind was a living thing, breathing in the space between Thomas and his children. He straightened slowly, his knees popping, and looked past Ben to where Lila stood rooted to the earth. "You gonna say anything, darlin'?" The old endearment scraped raw against her heart. Lila's fingers tightened in the fabric of the sheets. "You left," she said, and it wasn't an accusation, just a fact heavy and unchangeable as a headstone. Thomas flinched. He had ridden out at first light that final morning, Martha's promises ringing in his ears, his children still awed. He'd told himself the money was worth it, that they'd understand when they were older. Now he saw the truth in Lila's eyes. Some wounds didn't heal clean. Mr. Dawson chose that moment to step onto the porch, his boots thudding against the wood. He didn't speak, didn't intrude, but his presence was a reminder of the choice looming over them all. Thomas swallowed hard. "Sheriff says Martha's bound for trial. Could be years before she's free." He scuffed a boot in the dirt, avoiding their eyes. "I could take you home. Start over." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. Ben turned instinctively toward the house, toward the room that had become his, with its little wooden horse carved by Mr. Dawson on the bedside table. Lila didn't move at all. Thomas exhaled, long and slow, as if letting go of something precious. "Or," he said, the word barely more than a whisper, "you could stay here." Lila's chin lifted. "You'd let us?" It was the first real question she'd asked him in years. Thomas looked at his children, really looked, and saw what he'd been too blind to notice before. The way Ben's shoulders had lost their perpetual hunch. The faint color returning to Lila's cheeks. The way they both glanced toward the Dawsons as one might glance toward a harbor in a storm. His throat worked. "Ain't about what I want," he said at last. "It's what's right." Mrs. Dawson moved then, coming down the steps with a pitcher of lemonade sweating in her hands. She poured a glass for Thomas without a word, her kindness a balm over the ragged edges of the moment. He took it with a nod, his fingers leaving smudges on the cool glass. Later, after the sun had dipped below the horizon and the fireflies had begun their nightly dance, Thomas stood to leave. He pressed a kiss to Ben's forehead, hesitated, then cupped Lila's cheek with a hand that trembled. "Be happy," he said, and it sounded like both a blessing and a plea. As his silhouette faded into the twilight, Lila realized she was crying. Not for the father he'd been, but for the one he might have been, and for the family she'd found in his absence. Behind her, the porch light burned steady against the dark. Autumn came to the Dawson ranch in a blaze of crimson and gold, the trees shedding their leaves like old regrets. The mornings grew crisp, the air sharp with the scent of wood smoke and ripening apples, and the children no longer guests, but family in every way that mattered rose with the sun to meet each day as if it were a gift. Lila no longer startled at the sound of a raised voice. Ben no longer hid scraps of bread beneath his pillow. The past had not vanished, it never could, but its edges had softened with time, like stones worn smooth by a relentless river. The courtroom in town had long since delivered its verdict on Martha, her fate sealed behind iron bars where her cruelty could no longer reach them. Thomas visited when he could, his pockets full of penny candies and his eyes full of quiet sorrow, but the visits grew fewer as the months passed. It was not out of neglect, but understanding some fences, once broken, could not be mended in a season. In the warmth of the ranch house, life unfolded in a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. Lila learned to read properly, her fingers tracing the words in the old storybook Mrs. Dawson kept on the shelf, her voice growing stronger with each page. Ben followed Mr. Dawson like a shadow, his small hands now sure as they gripped a hammer or smoothed the mane of a skittish colt. There were still nights when nightmares came creeping, when Lila woke with Martha's laughter ringing in her ears, or Ben cried out for someone who no longer had power over him. But now there were arms to hold them, voices to soothe them, and mornings that always dawned fresh and new. Winter brought the first snow, a blanket of white covering the scars of the land. The children, bundled in woolens knitted by Mrs. Dawson's hands, tumbled into the drifts with shrieks of laughter, their breath puffing like smoke in the cold air. Mr. Dawson taught them to track rabbits by their prints, to spot the delicate lace of frost on the windowpane, and call it beautiful instead of a warning of the barn's chill. Inside, the hearth crackled, and the smell of gingerbread curled through the rooms like a promise. Spring returned in a rush of green and birdsong, and with it came a letter from the county judge. The adoption papers, signed and sealed, arrived on a day when the wildflowers were just beginning to peek through the thawed earth. There was no grand ceremony, no fanfare, only Mrs. Dawson pressing the document into Lila's hands with tears in her eyes, and Mr. Dawson clearing his throat loudly before pulling them both into a hug that smelled of hay and honest sweat. Ben whooped and dashed outside to tell the horses, as if they might understand. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon in a wash of pink and orange, the family gathered on the porch. Lila leaned against the railing, her fingers laced with Ben's, and looked out over the land that was now theirs in every way that mattered. The fences stood straight, the animals dozed in their pens, and the house behind them hummed with the quiet contentment of a place well loved. They had been lost once. They had been broken. But here, under this wide and forgiving sky, they had been found. Subscribe for more stories of courage and hope. If this tale of resilience and redemption touched your heart, there are countless more waiting to be told, stories of light triumphing over darkness, of kindness healing the deepest wounds, of families forged not by blood but by unshakable love. Subscribe now to journey alongside characters who rise above their scars, to explore worlds where hope is never truly lost, and to remind yourself that even in life's harshest winters, spring always comes again. Turn the page. Begin anew. Your next adventure awaits.